Okay, so we'll just jump right in talking about the book and kind of what inspired it and some of the content. And hopefully, if it interests you, you'll purchase a copy or get to know us better through our ministry. So I'm an adult child of divorce. This book very much was inspired by my own story. Just really quick, just a few details about my own story. I grew up, had a lot of happy family memories, family vacations, a lot of like normal, stable things. And then around middle school, around 8 or 9 years old, my dad, for various reasons, started to emotionally withdraw from the family. There started to be a lot more conflict and fighting, and things became very difficult, very contentious. And then around 11 years old, I discovered a note that my father left for my mom, but I got home first from school before she got home from work. My grandparents would pick me up, drop me off, saying my dad was leaving. And that devastated me to find that note and then to share that news with my mom. Just so many emotions. I felt ashamed. I felt guilty. I had to break this news to her. I felt betrayed. I felt abandoned and confused. Like, what's my life going to look like? And just a lot of fear. And so my dad moved out when I was 11 years old. And then the following years, for the next 15 years, were on and off attempts to reconcile. So you never sort of certain, would they get together? Would they not get together? They never moved back in with each other, but they would try counseling, be on and off again. And at a certain point, maybe in that 15-year cycle, I felt like it was impossible for them to reconcile because of so many things where it looked like it was going to be close, and then a crisis hit. I just felt really confused and then just very angry why they couldn't make it work, why they couldn't put in the effort to heal the things that they need to heal. And there were certain discoveries I found later that really rocked my boat and just made me even more and more angry. And as, a typical male high school student dealing with what felt like too much in his family, it came out in anger, but also I just stuffed it down really deeply, stuffed it down where nobody could find it. But of course, deep pain has a way of keep resurfacing. It resurfaced in my disbelief in love, for instance, that relationships could last. It resurfaced into, of course, my anger. I would become misdirected. I would take it out on myself. I felt like a failure. I felt ashamed. I even felt guilty that somehow the separation was my fault because my father would often tell me, like, I did this for you because I was just so miserable and I didn't want you to see all this fighting. But the irony was they kept fighting, except, now they triangulated me into the fighting, like, tell your mom this and then that. So I took that literally when my father, his attempts to justify the divorce, I took it literally that somehow I gave him this idea that I wanted this, which I didn't. So a lot of low self-esteem issues, and it led to a lot of poor choices, relationships, and also my faith. My faith really suffered during this time. I kept going to Mass, but that was primarily to appease my mom because I was a people pleaser too, just to not rock the boat, not cause my mom more pain. But internally, I really stopped believing. So there was all these things going on, and because there were so many layers to this pain, I just stuffed it down. The turning point for me was when I allowed just a little bit of light into that darkness and allowed some vulnerability and actually shared to somebody what was going on. And for me, that happened at a series of retreats, senior year into college. I went to college here. If there's any Catholic University of America alum, I went to CUA, and that really began the healing process to allow just a little bit of crack of saying, hey, this is what's going on in my life. This is why I'm suffering. And I realized the more I talked about it, the more that I realized there were so many other people suffering as well. Their parents divorced when they were 6, 7, 8, similar to my story. But it wasn't until young adulthood or adult that they felt they could really deal with this. I'm like, that's so fascinating. And the more I sought healing, the more I realized the crucial need there was for more resources in this area, because I was able to piece together my healing over the course of 10 to 15 years through mentors, through the church's teachings, going to the John Paul II Institute. I went to counseling for several years. But I shudder to think of who I would be today if I hadn't found those people and those resources and eventually pieced together some specific ways to heal. And it just made me realize there's got to be a better way in the church to do this, to help other people like us. Because I know being from a broken home is not a death sentence. I know we can thrive. I know we can have great marriages. I know we can break the divorce cycle and do all these great things in our lives, but we need some help. Just like, nobody comes out unscathed in this life. We're all wounded in some way, and we need specific help for the wounds we're given. So I knew there had to be something better we could do for the church. And so that my own story really motivated me to do something, to give back. I was supremely saddened to find out so many dioceses, for instance, had ministry to divorcees, but nothing to adult children divorced. They weren't even aware that it was an issue. When I started this ministry, they're like, well, their parents divorced so long ago. This is still an issue for young adults and adults. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. This is a huge issue. It's not until adulthood we feel like we can really address this, or we get into a serious relationship and we even realize that there's a problem to begin with. So I realized the time had come to do something in the church, to create a ministry, and it started off as a simple retreat ministry, but it eventually led to this book too. So that's why we set off in the course of Life-Giving Wounds. Was initially out of my own experience and the lack of resources in the church.
Okay, so now to broaden the lens, we're going to move from Dan's personal story into a wider picture of family breakdown and the effects it has on children. First, we want to be really clear about who we're talking about. Who do we mean when we say adult children of divorce or separation? These include, of course, those whose parents married and then divorced, and that is no matter why or when that happened. It includes when Catholic parents go on to get a declaration of nullity. That's a uniquely Catholic thing. Those children, too, are also children of divorce with another layer of whatever the declaration of nullity process, brings up for them. But we're also speaking to those who are not technically children of divorce because their parents were never married or they're currently separated. And that group includes the growing number of people whose unmarried parents either cohabitated but later broke up. Cohabitation is an even more unstable form of relationship than marriage. So all of those people are who we're talking to in our ministry, anyone who's lost the love of their parents together, no matter the circumstances. When we put all those people together, we come to a startling statistic that now less than half of children today in the United States will have a childhood where their parents are continually married. Less than half. And here, too, we have to acknowledge the phenomenon of gray divorce, when parents divorce later in life. That's actually the fastest growing segment of divorce in our culture. So for people who are already adults themselves and whose parents split up. So this is far from a niche group. This is millions upon millions of people. Looking at it statistically, it's soon going to be the majority of people in our country that come from that background, that don't have their parents together until death do us part. And a lot of people also have some family reconfiguration. It's more common when your parents split up to then have step-parents enter the picture, possibly step-siblings. So it's a very confusing and unstable landscape of family life today, and children are right at the heart of it. We also want to stress that the fallout caused by family brokenness affects so many other areas of the church. It's not just one isolated issue. It affects evangelization and bringing people back into the Catholic community. It affects pro-life issues. When we talk with people who do post-abortion work, the women that they see in that work, by and large, come from broken homes. It affects how we're talking about marriage, encouraging openness to the vocation of marriage, preventing divorce, helping couples thrive, transforming the culture's view on marriage, on sex, on sexuality, on pornography, and so much more. So one thing that we're trying to do in our ministry and in our book is put all those pieces together and really make an argument that to heal the culture, we need to be looking at these family wounds and help the people affected heal. They have to go hand in hand. So we're trying to make a real clarion call for Catholic leaders to take this issue seriously and see those interconnections.
So in other words, parental divorce is not a second-tier issue. It's interwoven with everything else. We have to address it. It hurts children. It affects them for many, many years into adulthood, if not one's entire life. So that's got to be front and center of our message of trying to heal the culture. Now we're going to segue a little bit to our book. And again, if you want more statistics, we can get into it in the Q&A. I know that was very short. But again, what's the book? So the book I said is based on my story, but it's also based on our work in Life-Giving Wounds. We are the largest Catholic apostolate to adult children divorce separation in the country, probably in the world. We're now international. We have 20 chapters, and we've accompanied close to 2,000 adult children divorced now. The main locus of it, though, is the Arlington, D.C. area, which we're at. So this book is really, we wanted it to be a communal project. So yes, it has my story. Yes, it has the statistics. It has the psychology interwoven, but it's very much our work of accompanying close to 2,000 people and their stories that make up the bulk of this work. Because Life-Giving Wounds is aimed to give voice to that pain of adult children divorce separation, all the different stories that go into it, along with the commonalities. And that forms the heart of our book. So you'll see a lot of stories that illuminate the points we're going to talk about today. But in the interest of time, we can't get into all those stories, which I think is really fascinating and beautiful. But I just want to say at the outset that this book is very much communal knowledge from our work accompanying other ACODs.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit about the book's content. That's going to be kind of the last final section of our talk, is just going over what do we share in our book, which is very much what we're also doing in our ministry. We structured the book to look at 7 different common wounds that a lot of adult children of divorce experience, and also pairing them with 7 remedies, 7 paths for healing from these wounds. All the paths of healing, in some sense, draw from the Christian doctrine of redemptive suffering. That forms the heart of everything that we do. Everything that we talk about is seen through that lens of redemptive suffering. So the 7 wounds that we look at, and some of which Dan touched on in his story, I'll try to bring those out, are the wound of silence, the wound to faith, the wound of a broken identity, the wound of a damaged vision of marriage and unhealthy self-protection, the wounds of anxiety, anger, and sin, the wound of unforgiveness, and the wound of unhealthy family dynamics. So I know there's a lot. If you want to know everything we have to say about it, you'll have to buy our book. But we're going to touch briefly on we'll touch briefly on each of those. Both what do we mean when we talk about those wounds, and then what are some ways of healing for each of those.
Also, we don't have time to get into this today, but after every other chapter, we give the spousal perspective. Mm-hmm. So how do you heal as a couple? To heal, you have to do some individual work, but you can heal as a couple too. And we know that's one of the greatest means of healing, is to have that secure attachment in a relationship that can undo the harms from the past. And what does that mean to have a healthy relationship? Again, we can't get into it here. Our book begins to get into it, and it's actually like the second work we're working on is how to do more as a couple. Also, I just want to say from the outset that not every adult child divorce is going to struggle with all these wounds. We've sort of made, if you will, kind of a checklist, and you can examine your own life. Like, I struggle in this area, but not this area. So that's kind of why we identified these 7, but it doesn't mean that all adult children divorce struggle with all 7. Although if you do, which I feel like I have, that's okay too. Again, nobody comes out unscathed from this life with wounds. So anyways, let's jump right into it. So the first one we talk about is the wound of silence, which is kind of like a way of explaining this phenomenon that there's this inability to grieve this wound. And we know that through so many studies, so much of healing, happiness, joy comes through the ability to grieve well. But this wound in particular, there's this inability to grieve. And we outline in the book there's so many different reasons for this. I think we cataloged like 14 in our book. And it can be anything from, it's traumatic. It's an event, it's a negative, adverse event that outpaces our ability to cope in a healthy way. Right, that's the definition of trauma. To, we feel like we're being disloyal to our parents bringing this up. To, maybe there's a stigma and shame. Like, if I bring this up, people are going to look at me different, especially potential suitors or boyfriends or spouses. They'll think less of me, which we should never do as Christians, right? We're not the sum of our wounds, never, or more than that. One of the most common reasons that I'll end here for purpose of time is the normalization. The normalization, because it's so frequent, everybody expects you to get over it fairly easy. And we can chronicle all sorts of stories we've been told in different ways that it's not that big of a deal. And this comes from society's unwillingness to accept that parental divorce hurts children. There's this huge pushback against it. And immediately as you say that, you're like, well, what about cases of abuse? Okay, yes, the church does allow in the catechism for exceptions like these situations of abuse to separate and divorce, and there can be some good positive benefits from it. But the vast majority of divorces hurts the children. And even in those cases where abuse occurs, we always like to point out there's still two wounds. There's the wound of abuse, but there's still the wound of losing the love of your parents together. All right? So there's many wounds here with parental divorce that needs to be acknowledged, and the church has to step up from knowing the truth about marriage to acknowledge that this is, again, in a majority of cases, not all, a sin. It's suffering upon the children. So that's what we mean when we talk about the wound of silence.
Mm-hmm. As far as a pathway to healing, when we talk about that in our book and in our ministry, it's twofold. First, finding those people in your life that can receive that wound, people who can listen, accept that this is a painful situation, and accept the ongoing painful emotions about your parents' split, their separation, and be compassionate when those new hurts arise. That's one thing. I think one of our favorite things about doing this ministry is finding when we bring people together who have similar backgrounds, that connections that they can make and that feeling of, I am not alone in this. There are other people who have gone through this. I'm not alone. I can talk about it. The other person is not going to, quickly go to the silver lining. We can sit with this a little bit and grieve together. And then the second pathway that we advise is to grieve well. So as Dan indicated, we've met a lot of people who may have never grieved their parents' split. We find this often with older people who come on our retreats, people in their 60s and 70s that may still have never felt the permission or the ability to grieve what happened in their family. We know that grief can be scary and it's hard. So we outline 7 marks of Christian grieving. St. Paul tells us to grieve not as those without hope. So kind of what does that look like? To both grieve, but do so with hope. Do so in a Christian way without falling into a victim mentality or hopelessness. And a lot of that has to do with that theological virtue of hope. Not just hope that maybe my parents are going to get back together. That can be something truly to pray about, to pray for, but hope that no matter what, Jesus is present in that pain and our suffering is not meaningless.
And just here too, the need for couples to be willing to grieve together is so crucial for love, for the unity. Often when we get marriage talks for formation, things like that, we talk about the need to have a unity of woundedness in marriage. It's incredibly important to a secure attachment, to a deep friendship, to a deep relationship. Again, in the Q&A, we can talk more about that. But it's very important to honor those wounds, to love those wounds. And it's okay. It's okay to get into the emotions. They won't wreck you. They're sacred grounds that are telling you something important about your fiance, spouse, or girlfriend, boyfriend that can bring you closer together if done well. The second wound we talk about is the wound to faith. We know statistically that men and women from broken homes are less likely to be active members of their faith community, to belong at organized religion at all. And if they do belong to an organized religion, they're less likely to go to mass on the weekends, to regularly attend a service, things like that. And we kind of outline why that's the case. Again, there's so many different reasons. One, the lack of care by many children of divorce they felt from their church families. I think Marquardt has a statistic we quote in our book that 2/3 of young adults said nobody from their church community reached out to them and acknowledged their loss from their parental divorce growing up. I mean, that's crazy, just acknowledging loss, let alone giving them some practical help along the way. There's practicalities of shared custody, not being able to consistently be part of a parish growing up. We probably lost access to it in a lot of cases, despite wanting to. But there can also be the heaviness of the feeling that our parents were hypocritical in their own faith if they were church going, but they still got divorced, or members of the community encouraged them to divorce, or they used scripture to divorce. I've heard all these stories growing up, and again, this is part of my story as well. That just crushes us. Like, well, if this is Christianity, I want nothing to do with it. We can feel that heaviness. One adult child divorce said it so beautifully. I felt abandoned not just by my father and mother, but I felt abandoned by God. And so there's that age-old question, where were you, God, in the midst of this suffering? And we can have questions about the familial language of our faith. We can have questions about teaching on marriage and family. So you put all these things together, it makes sense why we would struggle with faith. But the beauty of it is the church has answers to this, and there are answers. There's a way forward to deepen your faith.
Yeah, some of the things that we talk about in terms of addressing that wound to faith include just helping people better understand church teaching when we're talking about God as Father, how that's an analogous, we're talking an analogy. It's God who's the archetype of Father. And no matter how our own earthly father has been, that doesn't change who God the Father is for us, reclaiming the depth of that meaning of father and mother that we have in our faith. We also draw people back to the basics of the faith that are so rich. For instance, the identity we gain in our baptism as children of God. This is really deep. It's one of those phrases that we might use very tritely, or it's very common to say children of God, but when we reflect on it, what value that brings to us, and how that helps to heal that relationship with God the Father and our belonging to the church. And then we also exhort our church body, our parishes, to better care for children of divorce. Pope Francis has a beautiful phrase that parishes are meant to be a family of families, and especially for those that don't have an active family or a healthy family, that others in the parish community can be like a family for them. That is a beautiful thing for those that don't have that living, breathing Christian family to rely on.
And we offer more too, like how to handle hypocrisy, the wound of hypocrisy, etc., in the book that we can't get into here. The next wound we talk about, again, just to give you an overview, is the wound of a broken identity. Oftentimes this can be kind of invisible to studies, looking at the exterior harms, like, oh, they might struggle in school, they might struggle with XYZ in their career, in relationships. Those are very visible. But what is not what is invisible oftentimes is what a person thinks of their own identity. And we've seen this, there's this deep self-loathing, self-condemnation that can happen in the wake of parents' divorce, separation. And this can occur for any number of reasons. I'm a big movie guy, by the way. So like throughout the book, you're gonna hear a lot of movie analogies. And the movie analogy I kind of want to use right now, has anybody seen the movie Oppenheimer? Yes? Okay. All right. Great movie. There's some unfortunate gratuity of, there's some gratuitous nudity, full disclosure, that I don't accept, but it was a great movie. And it's interesting in Oppenheimer, something that's missed by a lot of the reviews are Christopher Nolan, great film director, is making a parallel that the destruction of the atom bomb is very much like the destruction of the family of what was going on in Oppenheimer's life by having an affair. And they both have fallouts. And as I was watching this movie, I was thinking of this great quote, this adult child divorce who's a director, his name is Nicky Rowden, said that, and this kind of encapsulates the broken identity, he describes his parents' divorce as like a nuclear bomb going off, splitting the atom of his existence into two and leaving him with a lifetime of emotional fallout. That's how he describes it. Splitting the atom of his existence into two, leaving him with a lifetime of emotional fallout. And I think that language is pretty precise. You feel split into, you go between two homes, two different moral codes, two different religions, two different ways of being, two different readings of the divorce. You're constantly split between the two, and you have to negotiate, because why? You're the fruit. You're always united to the two of these people. Even if one's absent, even if one's abandoned, you have no contact, you're still thinking about that as, you negotiate your identity. You're the fruit of this union, right? As Catholic anthropology states so often, that children are a living embodiment of that union. So what happens when that union breaks up? You feel that real split in your existence. There's something of that poetry of Nicky Rowden that gets it. It can't be described by any statistics or any other way of describing it, because it's so deep. So what is it? How do we recover our identity of have an integrated self to put ourselves together? That takes work and raises a lot of deep questions. So that's what we're getting at with the wound of broken identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here too, simply seeing and acknowledging this wound is the first step towards healing it. And here too, our Catholic faith is such a treasure to us that we have that. We know that our most fundamental identity is not as a child of divorce, but as a child of God. St. John Paul II talked about the genealogy of the person in Letter to Families, how each of us trace our genealogy to God the Father. He is the source of our life, mediated through our human parents. And we also stress here the fundamental identity we gain in baptism, coming back to that again and again, where we're named and claimed by God as a member of his family. And that never changes, no matter the permutations of our earthly families. And finally, we discuss it fairly at length about reclaiming and reliving one's own childhood. A lot of children of divorce feel like they have to grow up really fast. They may have to take on parental type roles. They lose that sense of leisure or play that children, rightly, naturally have. So reclaiming features of childhood through intentional resting, like honoring the Sabbath, through being with Jesus and adoration. We see adoration as such a key piece of healing in general, but just that resting and receiving from the Lord, the fact that he loves us, no matter what we do, not for anything that we do, but just for who we are.
And there's other childlike virtues that we outline in the book that need to be recovered, that we may have lost. That's part of the good life of adulthood as well. It's not just for childhood. And also, speaking of these things, we need to speak truth to these lies that come up. We talk a lot about in our ministry. It's not so much a problem if you feel anger, anxiety, but what you really want to watch out for is if that goes into self-loathing. That you really want to attack. And you need to start attacking that by speaking truth. So you think, I'm a failure. No, you need to replace that. Speak truth. I'm a child of God who's learning. You see the difference? So again, that's why these truths of the faith are so incredibly important to help us heal. And it gets really practical with attacking, these false thoughts that have come from our wounds. Okay, the fourth wound, the wound of a damaged vision of marriage and unhealthy self-protection. Again, a common consequence for adult children of divorce is that they have a damaged vision of marriage. In our book, we kind of outline two large headings that encompass so many different flawed views of marriage and family that we can't get into. But the two broad headings are romanticism or cynicism. The romanticism is what exalts the relationship above all else. It exalts the feelings. Love is a feeling. Love is whatever I want it to make it to be. And exalts the other as my savior, right? That's very disordered. And there's a lot of problematic views of marriage that fall under it. The flip side of it is that cynicism, that love can't last. I'm not capable of love. Marriage can't last until death do us part. All these ways of cynicism, but there can be hidden cynicism of simply, I just don't want a divorce. That's a cynical view of if you're entering into marriage, okay, that's good. That's a good goal, but we want you to thrive. Marriage, there's a positive love here to strive after, not just simply not divorcing, right? There's a hidden cynicism in that, although that's a good first step. But there can also be a cynicism of just emotionally withdrawing, protecting our hearts. And we talk about in our book at length unhealthy self-protective behaviors that can sabotage a relationship. Because we had to self-protect growing up in the chaos. But when we move into a relationship that is good, that is healthy, we need to put these tendencies aside and retrain our hearts to give. That's why I love the church's teaching. She'll talk about this is the remedy, is total self-gift over those self-protective behaviors.
Yeah, going deep and recovering that authentic truth of marriage and family. Because what we found, through our own ministry, through our lives, is it can sometimes feel like an ideal. Oh, that's nice. The church has beautiful things to say about marriage, but I don't actually think that's possible. So in addition to really just knowing what the church teaches about marriage and family, we really stress finding the mentors who can show that that's lived, that's possible to live out. For Dan, that was his grandparents. They were and are, even they have passed on now, but are the model that we really take for our own marriage, of a marriage that lasts and is beautiful. And it's kind of shocking to us how many people we meet that don't have anyone in their lives that's managed to get married and stay married. So thinking of how difficult it is to know how to do marriage when you don't have that model in a lived way around you. And then we always encourage adult children of divorce that far from being damaged goods or unlovable, or the sense that I just bring so much baggage to these relationships, of seeing that coming from a broken home and putting in the work that it takes to heal and receiving that healing from the Lord helps them have what we call a hidden superpower, that there is so much intentionality in those relationships, a strong desire and commitment to never divorce or even consider it. For me, that's something that I love about about Dan that coming from the background that he does, he always puts in the work to make our marriage stronger. There's never anything taken for granted. So we want to kind of flip the script a little bit and not have adult children of divorce always see like all the negatives that I'm bringing into this relationship, but seeing how those can be transformed into being even better spouses, even better parents, if that healing is received from the Lord.
Because, I mean, side note, a huge problem in our society is so many people from intact homes taking for granted these healthy habits that they were given and not practicing them. And all these divorces came from somewhere. They came from an intact home at some point. So again, the beautifulness about adult children divorce being intentional about healing is they can really strengthen that couple, that relationship. And just like a scab, a scab, as you know, is actually stronger than the original skin. I don't know if you knew that, but like when a scabs over, some laughing, I'm sorry if there's like somebody who knows more about medicine, it's stronger than the original skin that was lost. And that's what you put in this healing work. It creates an even stronger relationship than if you've never had to go through that at all. That's why repair in relationships is so beautiful. Repairing a relationship is not just simply putting it on the footing before, but it should make it stronger. Okay, the next one we talk about, anxiety, anger, sin. We know very common. There's a lot of emotions we could have talked about. We needed to narrow it down. We could talk about sadness, shame. We just didn't have, only so many pages. So we focused in a little bit on anger, anxiety. These are two very common emotions. And just what is righteous anger? What is sinful anger? What's a reasonable amount of anxiety? What's unreasonable? Where it becomes sinful, like into scrupulosity, things like that. We kind of try to give like a guide point through it. And we're not here talking about a clinical disorder. If you do have a clinical disorder, please do find professional help. We're just talking about the normal anger, anxiety that happens in the wake of our parents' divorce and lasts for many, many years. What do you do to deal with it? And we also talk about the wound. So often when we're dysregulated, whether it's anger, anxiety, fear, shame, whatever, it often leads to sinful ways of coping. So here we talk a lot about sinful ways of coping, needing to take ownership for addictions, seeking out sex to solve problems. Pornography is pretty rampant. Needing to take ownership of that, responsibility of that, and to heal that. And so that's the wound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we give some approaches, remedies, strategies in coping with those strong emotions. First, understanding, what's going on in your own heart when these emotions come up, and then kind of figuring out how do I deal with this? Because we're not left on our own when we're dealing with anger, anxiety, or any of those strong emotions. So we stress things like making a spiritual plan of life, figuring out which virtues do I really need to focus on. And that could come from outside help, from a spiritual director or a therapist. Of course, frequenting the sacraments. Seeking out that help, that could come from friends too, who are there to support us on our journey. None of these are easy, and especially if there's mental health challenges or deep-seated sins, that outside professional help can be needed. But more than anything else, we wanted to give hope that especially when the root wounds caused by that divorce or that family dysfunction can be seen and addressed, it's more than possible to find greater healing and peace. And I would say some of the most amazing stories that have come out of the people we've met in Life-Giving Wounds are those that have dealt with some pretty serious depression, anxiety, a lot of those really life-altering emotional challenges. And many of them, even through their journeys of therapy, had never really gone to that heart, that source of their family breakdown. And it's been beautiful to see in ways that those issues have been kind of cracked open by being able to look at the heart of what was happening and look at the whole picture.
Yeah, we've seen many miracles where it's been greatly alleviated. Maybe not fully gotten away from, but alleviated, and there's so much peace and joy in the person's heart. Also in the book, again, we can't get into it, we have kind of a unique method for cultivating virtue called the WASH method. So just side note, we really love this method we developed with our psychological advisors. That's in the book. The sixth wound we call the wound of unforgiveness. Now, often you don't hear about unforgiveness being a wound, but it does. It wounds us because it traps us in the past. It traps us on top of the original pain. We add the tension of being trapped, that resentment, that being focused on how could they have done this? I'm so angry, kind of trapped in that. I'll never forgive them. How dare they, so you add on top of that pain, that tension of being trapped. And one of my favorite quotes is by a Protestant, Louis Medes, who says, when you forgive, you discover you set a prisoner free. You discover that prisoner set free was yourself. So the Lord has made forgiveness as something good, not just for those who have hurt us, but for ourselves too. And we often miss that in conversations about forgiveness is how does it free our heart, increase our heart for capacity to love, because it absolutely does. And while we talk about different areas of wounds might not apply to adult children, divorce, etc., the two that absolutely apply to every case is grieving and forgiveness. And they go hand in hand. You can't forgive what you don't grieve. You can't forgive, what you don't know is a wound, right? So, when we see this in the sacrament of reconciliation, you have to be specific. You have to get into the specificity. And we have to combat these platitudes, these thought-stopping cliches that forgiveness is, somehow a 3-second act, or forgive and forget. We know great trauma and great harm isn't forgotten. That's not the essence of forgiveness. It's a choice, right? To let go of the anger, to let go of it, not forget it, but to consciously let go of it little by little by little. So that's what we have to get into, the misconceptions. Sometimes forgiveness has been weaponized against us. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard where it's like, oh, you just need to forgive your parents. Like, it's no big deal. Like, it's just something I can do on a Saturday morning, here in this audience, just after 5 or 10 minutes. I hate that. I hear that sometimes. I'm like, I'm working on it. Do you know forgiveness is a process? It takes a very long time. And Jesus says it's 70 times 7 times, which means it's going to take a long time. It's an ongoing process. So I'm sorry if it's been weaponized against you. That's another layer of the wound of unforgiveness.
Mm-hmm. So in our book and in our ministry, we try to both show the why of forgiving, as Dan has mentioned, reflecting on, there's translations of the Lord's Prayer that talks about forgive us our debtors. And with divorce, there's a debt that's owed to the child that should have been able to grow up in an intact, loving home. That debt may never be repaid, and that's a difficult place to sit in. But that's where Jesus meets us there. And a lot of the forgiveness process is figuring out, okay, Lord, how do I release this debt that someone does justly owe me, but may never be repaid? And that can bring so much freedom and peace, but it is, as Dan mentioned, a process. So the other thing is we try to show the how of forgiving. So at least we found that often, even talking about forgiveness, it wasn't always those practical steps of like, how do I actually do this? We try to break that down. And particularly for adult children of divorce, what do I do? Like, how do I forgive a parent? What does that look like? And that could look like writing out the hurt very specifically, writing a letter that may or may not ever be sent to that person. The hurt may never be actually communicated. We do give some guidance on if you feel like you're in a place to verbally or write out, what you want to say to your mom or to your dad, how to do that in a healthy way. But it's not an essential thing. It's not like that's a requirement to do, but just reflecting on how do we actually go about forgiving? What does that look like in a practical level to not leave people kind of stranded, like, I know I need to forgive, but I don't know what that looks like or how to even go about it.
And just to be clear here, we distinguish between forgiveness, which is the internal work of our hearts, and reconciliation, where we approach another person about the hurt and try to repair and deepen the relationship, which is not fully in our control, right? It takes a two-way street for reconciliation, but we can always forgive even if the other person doesn't say I'm sorry, even if they're not willing to engage us, even if they've abandoned us, hurt us, and it's even not safe to engage them. So just so you know, we distinguish between forgiveness and reconciliation, but we do give strategies for both. But I will say this, we always say you have to do the work of internal forgiveness first before attempting reconciliation, or it's going to go sideways. And that's okay if you've made flawed attempts or problematic attempts at reconciliation. That's okay, just recommit to it. The last wound of unhealthy family dynamics is, that is the wound of unhealthy family dynamics. And here in this chapter is kind of a catch-all for all the complex challenges that might come up after parental divorce separation, the step families, the different relationships through half-siblings, step-siblings, siblings, and even sibling dynamics we talk about, ongoing boundary violations, being triangulated, being parentified, being basically a parent to your siblings instead of an advisor, instead of like a friend, a sibling relationship. So we get into like all these different dynamics and a lot more than what I just mentioned as kind of, and this is what we try to point out, is that the parental divorce separation is not just one moment in time, but it's like a little stone thrown into a pond that sends ripples throughout life that come up every holiday, every major milestone, especially around one's vocation. I will just say that seems to bring it all out. It keeps coming up. And so what do you do with this wound that keeps coming up? Because again, it's not just the divorce, but the actual separation of our parents creates this dysfunction that remains. That's out of our control, the dysfunction. What's in our control is our response, and that's the remedy.
Yeah, so two main things we talk about in this section are the healthy boundaries. What does that look like? What does it mean to have a healthy boundary? How do you go about discerning that? Trying to clear up misconceptions. For example, thinking that setting any sort of boundary is not being loving to that person, or not following the fourth commandment to honor your father and your mother, for example. And also practical advice about preparing spiritually and emotionally for those, whether it's a family gathering, whether it's your own wedding, whether it's your child's baptism, whatever those moments are that are going to bring perhaps people together in your family that don't get along, or a person is going to be absent, and the sadness of not having a parent present. And part of that, we also try to encourage people that it's okay to prioritize the vocation that God has given you, the vocation of marriage, for example, that for us, like, our priority is our family, is our marriage and our children. And we want to honor all the other people in our life, but it's okay for us. We have to say no to requests that come. The family is splintered enough that there's just no physical way to honor all the different requests, and that's okay to be at peace about that. And even for those who are not married, do not feel that you're constantly having to say yes to every single request that a chaotic family has created. There's so much more that we say in there, but just we felt like it was really important to go pretty granular and give advice for things that so many people have to deal with, but it's not always spoken about either in a Christian way or in as much detail to really make it helpful.
Yeah, we get very granular, like even how do you talk about it to your kids, or do you have to call your stepmom mom? I mean, we get into all these kind of thorny issues. In conclusion, the thread of our whole book is what we like to say is the joy of redemptive suffering. And that's a paradox, right? Redemptive suffering we often think as something difficult to do, something painful and hard, and that's true. But there is a joy that comes with redemptive suffering. And actually, it's been the key to our marriage. It's been the key to our healing. And this redemptive suffering, we kind of outlined in the last chapter, and it's going from redemptive suffering begins with inviting Christ into the pain, okay? It doesn't begin by us doing our own offering. A lot of times people associate redemptive suffering with offering it up. That's step number 2. We can't do that on our own. Okay, that would be Pelagianism, if you know what that is, trying to pull ourselves up with our own bootstraps, okay? No, we have to invite Christ into the pain. Then we offer it up, but there's more. Redemptive suffering is not just about offering it up, but often it's about persevering. But here's the key point: transforming the wounds. Christ wants to transform the wounds, and he wants to draw a greater good out of it for your life. Okay, he doesn't want us to just sit there, grin, and bear it. That's a stage. There is a certain perseverance that's necessary to redemptive suffering. There's a certain necessary patience that we need to have, especially as we try to change these wounds. But he wants to transform them, and that's what this whole book is about. Transforming the wounds, not just to a point where we don't have to deal with them, not just to a point of peace where they have less of a hold on our hearts, but transforming them into a resource for faith, hope, and love, for your friendships, for the good of the church, for your future vocation. And that's the 70-fold that the Lord wants to draw out of your wounds. He's not content just with you not dealing with them. He wants to make them a resource for your life. And that's what we try to do in every single chapter. And that's a whole message of hope, of life-giving wounds. And if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, I hope it's this: that there is this joy of redemptive suffering because wounds can be transformed. Yes, Christ didn't come from Christ didn't come to remove all suffering, all crosses from this life, but he did promise to fill it with his presence. And the more you fill it with his presence, he will transform it to some kind of good. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you, Dan and Bethany, for helping all of us, whether we are children of divorce or not, to just have that reminder of how Christ helps us in all our crosses. It's now time for the Q&A. If you are online with us, please submit your questions through the live chat, and I will ask them out loud. But I will start with the guinea pigs in the room. So I have the mic here, and just raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you all very much. That was really, really encouraging to hear, and at the same time, very empathetic as somebody of many, many divorces. So between my two parents, they were married 7 times. My mom was married 3 times, and my dad was married 4, although Ancestry.com now makes us think maybe 5. But one of the things that it did in my life that I wonder if you've heard or have addressed is extreme poverty. So when my parents divorced, we were homeless and we lived in a camper shell. And so that was very, very difficult, obviously, for children to go from a house to a camper shell. And the second thing that it did to us was it subtracted people out of our lives without our permission. Right? So I don't know if you hear that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those things. It's a pretty clear phenomenon that when parents divorce, it's generally the single mother and the children go closer to the poverty line, whether that's actually into poverty, just a lesser state of financial stability. And then just one more thing, I know you have stuff to say. And one thing that struck me, and this is kind of just expanding on what you said, I was shocked to find out that in terms of, for example, helping with a college education, if you're from an intact home, about 80% of those kids who go to college get assistance from their parents. It's like 15% of children of divorce. I mean, there's so many of those financial implications just absolutely ripple out. And then, of course, dealing with poverty is difficult on its own. And then knowing that that's coming from choices of the adults, in your life that are meant to give you a stable, not necessarily a rich life, but just that stability.
First, I just want to empathize. I'm so sorry. I mean, that's just horrible. I just get so angry. I mean, not just one divorce, but 7 divorces. And that poverty is incredible loss of security, of stability, of, there's so much wrapped up in what you just said, so many layers of wounds. And I'm just so sorry. And I'm angry on your behalf for that. And I have heard a lot about financial insecurity and how deep that goes. Because again, that cuts into our general security as children, our general self-esteem, and my own story too. It was bizarre. Like after my parents' separation, my mom was struggling right above the poverty line, but my dad had like a ton of money, and it was so weird going between those, like going from poverty to opulence. And it felt like there's something wrong and it's shameful. And I was very angry at my dad for not providing for my mom, who expected my mom, my mom expected my dad to be there. And we do address that. That comes up in relationships, right? And how much we're comfortable with taking on debt, how much we're comfortable with, savings and things like that. But there's a deeper issue. Like I always say, you often notice like enough never feels like enough with money, but that's because of the deeper insecurity issue that needs to be healed, right? And that very much is part of my story as well. So that's a real serious thing. So I just thank you for bringing that up, and that's something we address.
For what it's worth, though, so I'm only one divorce, but you can also use it as a motivator. So 32 years and 8 children, and we're still going at it.
Oh, beautiful.
I'm just saying, the opposite is the inverse of where you see all this terribleness in your childhood, and you go, "Boy, I sure don't want that for my children."
Right.
But I'm sure you guys see that, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's the fierce intentionality. Yeah. That's using your wound. That's transforming your wound. Right there. It's beautiful.
Not that it's better. It's
right.
not an easy road.
It's not. And there's probably more healing. And there's probably more healing. There's probably more healing that the Lord is calling you to. And that's one of our mantras too. Like when I got into my healing journey 15 some years ago, I used to loathe it. I used to hate it. I'm like, oh, I got all these layers and wounds. Where do I begin? But over time, I realized this is part of the good life. Like my little mantra that I share with others, that every layer of the wound is a lesson for love. So I know if I take the time, go into this layer, God's going to use this to help me be a better lover of my wife, of my children, of those around me. So I run to it. Like even this Lent, I'm doing this great Catholic story group to further my own healing. So, and then your second point, again, there's so much to be said. Yeah, there's a lot of relationships that's been taken away from us without our permission. And that can be very woundedness. And that's why we can struggle with jealousy, with close relationships, sometimes cling on to them. But then the flip side is we're really fiercely loyal as a friend. That's a great gift that can come from it. So while we can struggle with jealousy and clinginess, we can also be some of the most loyal friends because of that loss. Next question.
Yeah, so I kind of had a question on boundaries and like the boundaries you guys may have set with like your family, Dan. I'm in a situation where I always feel very torn between my mom and my dad, and like they both want me to live by them, and I just decided to live with, I just live by myself basically. I don't want to live with them, I don't feel quite at home in either place because there's always one parent missing and everything, and everyone in my family just treats it like it's perfectly normal, and it's really not, and everyone's moved on but me, and so I find that I don't really want to be around my parents, but at the same time I do want to witness to them with like the love that Jesus offers them, but it's like, how do I do that and also heal at the same time, and how would I, like in the future, if I have children down the road, like how would I be able to like bring them into this relationship with my mom and my dad without like approving of their sin or anything like that?
Can I just go first?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to speak some truth to, it's not everybody else has moved on but me, but you're actually dealing with the problem. You are actually confronting it head on, where everybody else is not. They're bearing it, or at least you don't know their story, and they've dealt with their wounds privately, and you don't know. Okay, but you're dealing with it, so it's not everybody else has moved on. You're not. You're actually confronting it head on. So I just want to affirm you for being courageous, because that's going to lead to a healthier, holier life. It's going to probably look far different from anybody who's just buried those feelings deep in your family and try to, fakely get on. Okay. So I just want to speak some truth. Like, you're doing exactly what the Lord calls you to do, which is to confront it head on, to call a spade, that this is not all right. This is affecting my life. This has affected who I am. This is wrong. It's okay to have anger. It's okay to have grief. Those are good things, right? Because the Lord did not make us for divorce. He did not make us for parental divorce. Right? He made us to be raised continuously with our parents until 18, and then even when we go off, to have our parents' union until death do us part. Right? Because it's not like just all of a sudden when we become 18, we don't need our parents together. No. There's a reason they promised till death do us part, and part of that's for the good of the children. So I just want to speak some truth. Like, you're addressing it head on. So good for you to that phrase. And then boundaries. Well, did you want to say something? Because I did a monologue. Okay, sorry. So it's totally okay to live on your own. Actually, that's really healthy. I think, what I see often can be the opposite, which is you can become too codependent on one or both parents, right? And you become really enmeshed in what they think of me, how they approve of my actions. And that's okay. If that's you in the crowd, I've dealt with both. We have people in our community that's either too enmeshed or too avoidant. And that's what you want to kind of look at your own boundaries. Like, okay, it's good that I'm independent, but I don't want to be completely avoidant. And by being in a relationship with your parents does not mean you're accepting or condoning their sin. It's actually the opposite. You're being very merciful and loving. Like, you've made it clear what you believe, or if you haven't, you can make it very clear that this is wrong. This is not, I don't accept this. But out of love, I'm going to choose to be in a relationship with you because you are my parents, and that's that's a merciful act. And that's how you can explain to your children. Now, your question to what we've done for boundaries in our own life is the question about where we live, or is the boundary like how much interaction we have?
That's more like how much interaction you would choose to have with like your parents, especially with your children around.
Can I say that?
Yep.
I think I was going to say, I mean, when we were researching for our book, we looked a lot at, okay, what does the church teach about the fourth commandment? Because that's really for us as Christians where a lot of these things come down to. You know, we know that God tells us to honor our father and our mother. And I found it really interesting that the catechism is pretty clear that when you're a young child, that includes obeying your parents. When you're an adult, it doesn't. You know, it's still respecting, it's speaking kindly of and to our parents, it's honoring them in those ways. But I just thought that was an interesting reminder that, like, okay, this is part of this commandment is not doing everything that my parents may want me to do at all points, you know, kind of seeing that through again, like what is my vocational call? That's so much a discernment. I know when we talk with our psychological advisors about boundaries, that's kind of the first place she always starts is like, talk about it with God. And that's an ongoing conversation. And that could be a conversation again to bring in like a spiritual director would be a great kind of getting to the nitty gritty of like, how do I feel when I'm with my parents? How do I react? How does it affect me? What ways does it help me be a better Christian? Or maybe it's making it more challenging. I need support in these ways. So without a one-size-fits-all answer, it certainly can change and morph over time. But I think having those guidelines of what does it mean to honor my parents within that realm, that just could look very different depending on the choices that our parents have made, the type of people that they are. And then when it comes to children, I think the things that we try to do, our kids are 6 and 4. They're definitely, especially our oldest, is becoming much more aware and asking like, you know, when we visit grandma and then we go to grandpa's house, like, why doesn't grandma come with us? So she'll ask her directly, like, grandma, are you going to come? And like, oh my gosh, like, no, she's not. Like, and having to, it's hard even for us, it like breaks our hearts again to be like, our kids have to see this brokenness. Number one thing we stress, mom and dad are never going to get a divorce. You know, that's like the number one thing because we don't want them to look at other people's splits and be like, ooh, is that a thing that people do? You know, like when they get older. So we stress that and then just really try to speak the truth in love. We don't try to sugarcoat it. You know, we definitely don't try to give platitudes. We also try to speak respectfully of all the people involved. Try to name things for what they are. Like we have grandma, we have grandpa, we have grandpa's current wife, you know, but he really is married to grandma, you know, in ways that they can understand. It's definitely challenging because it brings up more layers for us as parents than seeing our kids having to cope with this. But keeping that kind of those guidelines for us, I think, have been helpful.
Yeah, 2 other guidelines. Again, you know, come to our ministry events because we can go so much deeper into your particular story. But again, I'm presuming no abuse here. Abuse would be a different situation in which it's not safe for you to have an ongoing relationship. So I'm presuming here when I say this, there's no abuse. We want to avoid 2 tendencies of becoming enmeshed or avoidant. And what that looks like for you for the boundaries is going to be very different. And so one of the activities that we do in our support group is for you to look at the relationship that you're having the most problems with or you want to deepen and just draw a line, what's healthy, what's unhealthy, and then start thinking about the boundaries for what's unhealthy. And a lot of times we need to get outside perspective to understand what's unhealthy too. So that's why it's good to come to events like ours to talk with peers, like what is healthy, what's unhealthy, right? Or you have friends that have intact homes, things like that. And then start to put some boundaries on what's unhealthy is the advice I'd give you.
Can you repeat your website?
Lifegivingwounds.org.
Excellent. Just so that you can come to any of the events. Do you host virtual events?
Yeah. So in addition to the in-person chapters, so here in DC and Arlington, we do retreats, we have support groups, we have book clubs and masses and brunches. But we also have online ministry. So we do online support groups, online book clubs, and online retreats as well for those who, for whatever reason, need to take part of that. And we also have resources. Our blog is a great resource for healing as well. It's got expert pieces of advice. It's got first-person testimonials on all sorts of topics.
And our next online support group actually starts this coming Thursday. So we do have one that's going to be a 7-week online support group. You can find all the information on our website, or we can talk more in detail.
Lifegivingwounds.org.
Yes.
We can take 1 or 2 more questions.
A twofold question. One is like, do you see any differences in like when the parents do end up staying back together but separated for a time, and then there's just like not actual reconciliations? Like you still have the wounds of the divorce and the separation, but then yeah, just like those dynamics. And then two, like if the children were all different ages, like how do you help your siblings with that?
Yeah, great question. These are two big ones that grapple with in our groups. And again, I'm sorry for any pain that you've gone through by an unhealthy reconciliation. And that is something that is really painful. So on top of the divorce, there's this unhealthy reconciliation, the dysfunction remains, and parents continue to hurt each other. That's another layer of the wound. And that's why, too, we talk, like, we don't want just our parents to get back together, but to actually fix the dysfunction and do it in a healthy way. And that's why a lot of us kind of fear initially, and actually maybe long after, like, what's this reconciliation going to be like? And sometimes outsiders are like, well, don't you want your parents together? This is so strange. And it's like, well, yeah, but in a healthy way. Like, I don't see the progress being made with my dad's anger or emotional abusive tendencies. Like, that's really scary, right? So, this time when our parents may be going through reconciliation is very scary. And if it's not done in a healthy way where they've actually worked on the dysfunction, it can be an added layer of the wound and cause more harm. So yeah, absolutely. I'm actually talking to two people right now whose parents are thinking about reconciling, one in a healthy way and one in a very unhealthy way. So that topic absolutely comes up. We talk a little bit about that in our book. But we get into more details in our groups. And then, sibling relationships. Oh, these are like huge topics in our groups. We're always talking about sibling relationships because we all experience the divorce differently based on our age, based on our knowledge, based on our custody arrangement, based on so many factors. So I always tell siblings the first step to help each other heal and deepen our relationship, because also a lot of times, oh man, there's so much to get into. A lot of times, one of the wounds of parental divorce is strain amongst the siblings, and it causes sibling relationships to fracture because there's not enough love to go around. So you fall into these unhealthy roles, right? There's the rebel, there's the clown, there's the perfect one, there's the religious one. You know, have you ever seen Encanto? Have you seen, like, that's taking family systems theory, which I'm describing, which in an unhealthy family system theory, which that was, until then they start to reconcile. But it was unhealthy family situation. They take on all these roles that are unhealthy, and it causes sibling rivalry. Okay, but what they're doing is they're all hungering for the father and mother's love, and there's not enough love to go around, and parents play favorites and not, non-favorites, and that's so destructive, by the way. As a parent, you should never play favorites. You love all your kids equally, period. And that's very destructive, to be the favorite one, to be the unfavorite one. That's an unhealthy role that needs to be called out and dropped as an adult. So anyways, there's all these sibling dynamics that can harm the siblings, that as an adult, you first have to sort of rediscover anew each other as a true sibling role before even addressing all the wounds of one's parents' divorce and separation. It begins with rediscovering. It begins with asking them, what was this like for you? Because I know it can be very different for siblings, and grieving with them. And that's where I would start. But yeah, it's huge. And it's another loss. You're like, the ripple effect. And that's why it's not an accident that our first parents, our first great-great-great-great-grandparents, Adam and Eve, their sin spills over into their children, Cain and Abel, right? Where did that jealousy come from with Cain? The dysfunction of his family, the parents, without a doubt. There's a lot of indications from Scripture. So right there, it's something to meditate upon. But God's first question to us, last thought, God's first question to us is the beginning of reconciliation after we've been wounded. And his first question to us in the Scriptures, does anybody know what it is? It's a very simple one. Where are you? Somebody said it. Where are you? There you go. Start with that.
Thank you, Dan and Bethany.